Welcome to the Creative Condition podcast, an ongoing series of conversations and considerations to help people understand and embrace their own unique creativity for fulfilling lives and brilliant careers. My name is Ben Talon. I'm an illustrator and author, and I bring 16 years of creative industry experience working with the New York Times, The Guardian, the Premier League, and more. And I invite designers, artists, psychologists, scientists, coaches, athletes, sensitivity experts, and all kinds of thought leaders to help us broaden our knowledge of creativity. Creativity is a fundamental pillar of human happiness, a vital ingredient in the solutions to our problems, but so often misunderstood. The show is supported by founding sponsor and B Corp, Illustration X. Take a look at their stunning range of illustrators and animators at illustrationx.com. If you like the music for the show, it's by Dirty Freud, who you can listen to now on Spotify and all good music streaming services. Hello and welcome back to the show, guys. It's that time of the week when we wrap things up and we reflect on what we've learned and what have we learned this week about creativity from the wonderful Professor Carlos Moreno, pioneer of smart cities and 15-minute cities and all that stuff we got into about community and well-being and people over cars in terms of urban planning and all that. So go and check out the episode if you haven't yet. It's available as both a highlights package and the full-length episode. So without further ado, a little thank you for the founding sponsor, Illustration X. Without further ado, what did we learn about creativity from Carlos Moreno? Number one, slowing down is good for all. I think it's easy to forget what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, from the lockdown situation that none of us would have wanted, none of us want to return to. However, despite all the suffering, despite all the grimness that we, was horrific and awful, and it goes without saying, there were lessons, weren't there? There were lessons about the slower pace of life, about fulfillment in our day-to-day. Now, again, I speak as someone who, it was tricky in some ways. I had new twins during the lockdown, which was challenging for my wife and I. But there was certainly a trimming down of our to-do list. There was a slowing of pace, like I mentioned, and there was something about it that reminded us that maybe there's more to life than dashing about 1,000,000 miles an hour, commuting, being here, being there, wanting, needing, buying, and all that stuff. And the more people I speak to, I don't come across too many people who didn't take some solace from it. Even if they had a really shitty time and a really tough time, which it was for a lot of people, because it isn't natural for us to be trapped indoors and all that. And, I hope we'd do things differently if something came around again. But slowing down and that return to values taught us a lot. It's no coincidence that a lot of people started to create for the first time in a long time. People read those books, people wrote those stories, some people crocheted, some people baked bread and all that. But what was lovely about it was that we did have some time to think, and we did do some deep thinking and kind of reflect and course correct. A lot of people course corrected. And one of the things that Professor Carlos Moreno is calling for in his 15-minute city idea is exactly that, is less time sitting on super highways, choking on fumes and being away from our loved ones, going to and from jobs that require long commutes. It's about pulling back from materialism first and economic gain at the cost of everything, which is what we've been doing for far too long, and it's led us into a very troubling corner environmentally that could cost all of us dear in terms of the society that we cherish. So slowing down, I think, is going to be a solution. There were little regenerations of certain pockets of nature when humans weren't going about their day-to-day activities. I think that the 15-minute city concept can teach us a lot about that, about bringing us together and bringing those amenities closer in. And like I mentioned on the show, I don't think this is the sort of conspiracy version of locking us in. I think it's more about recognising the changes we need to make in terms of emissions, but also on a mental health crisis level, the disconnects and the gentrification and families getting pushed out further and further to suburbs from the places they grew up. It's not good for us and it's not right. And I think that slowing down and just, idling a little more and finding more fulfillment in our lives can only be a good thing. And that, of course, is a great thing for creativity. Number 2, proximity and local community are social equalizers. So Carlos speaks of business model cities, cities that have been designed with business and economy and corporations in mind, and not people, and not about market squares and nature and green spaces and public spaces, which is what he wants to push for to get us back to. And there's a lovely bit in the book where they talk about using like the local schools as community centres and having them open on the evenings and the weekends. And I think it's beautiful because I grew up in a town where people like to go into town and know people. And there's a fear that technology is dividing us, and these kind of narratives that we're exposed to all the time with 24-hour news cycles and conspiracies are really pushing us apart and dividing us into smaller and smaller bubbles, and it's damaging for those people. I have close family members and friends who rely on that kind of outreach and community by just being in a town where they know people and bumping into people and having chit-chats in the streets. And I think that if you open up more public spaces that are free to access rather than £4 for a coffee or £7 for a pint and, paying for car parking and stuff, I just think that bringing people together, not only does it bring you fulfillment and it ticks a massive evolutionary box of community and positive social relationships, but it also stops us from othering, because we look others in the eye and we know they're like us, we know that they're real. They might have a different skin colour, they might be from a different country, they might have a different religion, they might have different social values, but ultimately when you look another in the eye and you realise they're just trying to get by in life, it has a way of neutralising that fear and bringing you in and seeing that the other is just in some way like you. And it makes it easier then to get along and not be so fearful and have more trust in your neighbours and help one another out. And when that happens, creativity flourishes because intelligence flourishes, and belonging and love of one another and ideas generation is fostered, and it snowballs. And I just think it's really wonderful. And there's something about that idea of an open school on the weekends and evenings that really spoke to me, and I would love to see it. Number 3, cars have long been an antagonist of creativity. So anything from long commutes to wrecking neighbourhoods and communities by building freeways through them, or things like ripping up nature for HS2. I think there's a lot of damage that's been done by the sheer value we've placed on cars, and how marketing and advertising, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, taught us that having a car was a symbol of independence. And it's been so instilled in our minds that it's hard to shake. But really, what isn't the idea of what George Monbiot refers to as public luxury, private sufficiency? Doesn't that appeal? We can have big splendid parks where people can come together in green spaces, and we can have wonderful, efficient public transport that works and runs on time so that we don't need cars. We can walk places and cycle and see our mates in the street. To me, that fills my heart with warmth, and I want to see it, And when you learn about the sheer kind of influence the automotive industry has had on everything, on urban planning, on emissions and the climate crisis over the years, then there's a lot of looking in the mirror to be done in that industry. And I think that we need to challenge it collectively, because the voice of that industry is powerful, and they are going to push back on these kind of ideas because it really doesn't benefit them under capitalism. Number 4. Rebuilding our relationship with nature is key to Seikatsu Sha, which is the authoring of our own lives. So this is something that philosopher Dr. Kiyoshi Miki, who sadly died in World War II very young in 1945, this was a concept he came up with, and it's being the author of your own life, taking charge, not giving in to self-pity, and leading your own path, making your own way through life. I think that we require balance with nature to do that, because if we continue to disconnect from nature, and this is something I've been reading about this week in The Nature Principle by Richard Louv, which is a fantastic, profound book. I highly recommend it. And it's about the disconnect and how damaging that is for our intelligence, for our mental well-being, for our creativity. And I think that when we have that harmony with nature and we have access to green spaces, then we are far likelier to access Seikatsu Sha and take charge with a positive mindset. Now, there's a wonderful study in his book, The Nature Principle, which is about a study of 101 schools in Michigan in the United States, and how those schools reported something like a 30% overall increase in good test scores in the school for students who had access to nature, outdoor spaces, green spaces, even just a view from a classroom or a dining area window for 20 minutes elevated their application, their spirits. And there was also a correlating stat of heightened amount of students that were interested in going on to study at college, as you would call it in the States, or university over here. Incredible stuff. Really, really interesting. So I think to get there, we have to fix our relationship with nature. And the reason I'm telling you this, because one of Carlos Moreno's big things in his book is about re-greening, the cities and the streets and bringing more peace and visual beauty to those areas that are kind of run down and urban and litter riddled, and are just bringing our spirits down a little bit by, not having the kind of some Calcé values that I mentioned earlier. So, all that community and intergenerational equity and all those things. But there's so much to be said about nature. I highly recommend that book as a starting point. And finally, number 5, we must challenge even our most embedded behaviours and dependencies if we are to flourish creatively and in our lives, I've been reading Look Again, The Power of Seeing What Was Always There, a book about kind of habituation and how we become so accustomed to even the biggest threats and changes in our lives. It's a very natural genetic thing. There's a wonderful story about single-celled organisms that would go on to become us humans, tumbling out of the sea onto the beach. And even then, when the kind of mineral intake stabilised, they kind of took their foot off the gas and were like, it's fine. I've got what I need. Complacency and habituation is a very real thing. And it speaks to the way that we're not outraged by the horrors of the last government, in terms of all the money they blew on PPE, like billions and billions of the public kitty on kit that was just lining their mates' pockets, and how we're far easier riled by the poor neighbour down the street because they're different to us. It's bonkers stuff. But we really have to challenge those embedded behaviours. And when I speak of that kind of idea of moving away from cars and reliance on several cars per family and champion a public transport system and better designed cities, it's interesting how these conspiracies kind of spring up and emanate from this habituation to something that, even though we know it's doing us damage, we're so locked into the way things are that we find it very hard to raise our alert system in a sustainable level that will actually see us take action. And there's a lot to be learned there about creativity, because we do settle into these grooves, we do get familiar, we do habituate to what we're doing, even if it once filled us with magic. And that's when we disconnect, and that's when we burn out and start to question whether we even are creative anymore, or whether we love that craft, be it design, be it advertising, be it art, music, film. Very, very fascinating stuff. So there you have it. 5 things I learned from Professor Carlos Moreno, pioneer of the smart cities and the 15-minute city, on this week's episode of the Creative Condition podcast, episode 242. Thank you ever so much for listening, guys. Thank you to the sponsor, illustrationx.com, for their global range of illustration and animation portfolios. Check out the Ukrainian Institute at ui.org.ua and support their cause as they look to support the Ukrainian creative community at this horrific time of war. Coaching sessions are now available. I'm offering them a low introductory rate for the Pit Stop 1-to-1 intensive creativity audit, which will help you realign, or the workshops for businesses and agencies. And that's not just limited to my industry either. I want to get out there and help the likes of UNICEF and Greenpeace and organisations that are doing good stuff. If I can help them be more creative and understand creativity, then I'm going to be additive to the world, and that idea thrills me. There you have it, little plug for myself. Thank you guys for suffering that. Cheers for checking in. Have an awesome week. Stay creative.